want you to know I'm a rainbow too. To the rescue, here I am. Want you to know. Can you?
Should we start? Yes. Yes. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm so honored to have Medea here tonight. And I have she has an incredible bio, but she asks that it's short. But she's a co-founder of Code Pink and also co-founder of the human rights group Global Exchange, also the co-founder of Unfreeze Afghanistan. She's written 10 books. She's received numerous awards. She's also an economist and a nutritionist. And she will speak about Ukraine tonight. And there will be a short question and answer after her talk and book signing, and an opportunity to buy her book.
May I ask, would you kindly introduce yourself?
I'm Barb Schumann. I'm sort of part of that.
Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to have you. Bravo.
Tamara did the intro good. Bravo.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's really such an honor to be here. I've heard about Bread and Puppets for decades. We copied some of your wonderful puppets and have used them in protests on all kinds of different issues. So being here is very special. I must say I was concerned by the guy who was handing out the flyers. Maybe I should be honored because it said I'm the most famous pro-Putin apologist in the U.S. left. Wow. I don't think I'm that famous, and I'm certainly not a Putin apologist. So let me just say right off the bat that I really believe that if I lived in Russia, I would be in prison today for protesting this war in Ukraine. I do not apologize for Putin. I don't apologize for the invasion. I know that it's illegal according to the UN Charter. I know that it's immoral. I just recently came back from Ukraine. Oh, it also said in that pamphlet they were giving out that I don't know anything about Ukraine. Well, my father's side, they are Jews from Ukraine. I came back from Ukraine about a month ago and spoke to many Ukrainians, and I know lots of Ukrainians, and when people say, your position doesn't reflect the position of Ukrainians, you have to say, which Ukrainians? Because just like we are so divided in this country, there is so much division in Ukraine as well. And just to get a kind of lay of the land, there has been a division in Ukraine for a long time now between the western part of Ukraine that is very pro-West, looking towards Europe and the United States, and the eastern part of Ukraine that has been very pro-Russia. And there are a lot of ethnic Russians, Russian speakers that live particularly in the eastern part of Ukraine and in Crimea. So that's important to understand when you look at the dynamic. And while we criticize the Russian invasion, I do it as an anti-war activist. I think that a number of us here who are older have been anti-war activists for a long time. I started out in high school protesting the Vietnam War, and ever since then, I have been against war no matter who starts the war. I work very much on the issue of Yemen, a terrible, catastrophic war that is almost not covered in the US press. Work very much on the issues of Palestine, and it pains me so much coming from a Jewish background and knowing that my government gives almost $4 billion a year to the Israeli state that is used every day for the oppression of Palestinians. I am very pained by the wars that are going on in Africa right now. I spent 10 years in Africa, trained as a nutritionist, because my desire was not to see children suffer, whether it's suffering from a lack of food or suffering because they're victims of war. And certainly being in Ukraine, you feel the suffering of the Ukrainian people. It seems in some of the cities as if life is going on as normal. There are restaurants and cafes and bars that are open. There are people who are shopping in very fancy stores. And yet every day you will come across a funeral, particularly of young men who have been killed in the war. You see all over people who have lost their arms, who have lost their legs, who are walking on prosthetics. And you see in the cemeteries, the freshly minted graves where the wives are crying over the graves of their husbands who have just been killed, and the children are laying flowers on the graves of the fathers that they will never see. So let's recognize war is a crime. The suffering of people in the time of war is a crime. And we, if we care about people, have to do something about that. So we are not living in Russia. We are living in the United States. And so we have to look what is the role of our government in setting the context for this war, not to justify the war, but to understand the war. And there are two very important things that I want to lay as background information. One is the expansion of NATO. And people often say, well, really, that's exaggerated. It wasn't all that important. You know what? It is all that important, because it was, from the time of the breakup of the Soviet Union, a promise that was made by the U.S. and the NATO countries not to expand 1 inch eastward towards the borders of Russia. Why? Because Russia did not want a hostile military alliance on its borders. Totally understandable. Would the U.S. allow a hostile military alliance on its borders? Well, we know what happened in 1962 when there were Russian missiles in Cuba. The entire world almost blew up with a nuclear war. We are celebrating or commemorating or marking 200 years of the Monroe Doctrine this year, where the U.S. has not just said our border in Mexico, but said the entire Latin America and the Caribbean is our, quote, backyard, and we will not tolerate hostile military anti-U.S. governments in that region. So the agreement that was made when the Soviet Union was breaking on was violated over and over and over again by Democratic and Republican administrations, expanding and expanding NATO. In fact, in 2008, saying that NATO would offer membership to Ukraine, which U.S. ambassadors at the time in Russia, as well as academics, foreign policy experts, all said, that's a red line. Don't do that. It will cause instability in the region. And in fact, the guy who is today the head of the CIA, William Burns, was ambassador in Russia and said, expanding NATO is going to create such instability that it might well lead to a civil war in Ukraine, and Russia will be forced to decide if it has to get involved, something that it does not want to do. Lo and behold, totally disregarded, the U.S. and NATO expands. And let's also recognize that when we hear over and over again that NATO is a defensive alliance, it is not a defensive alliance. It is an offensive alliance. It is a dangerous military alliance that first illegally got involved in the bombing of Kosovo, but then went way beyond the North Atlantic to invade Afghanistan. It went way beyond the North Atlantic to overthrow the government of Gaddafi in Libya. And at its last meeting that just happened recently in Vilnius, Lithuania, not only were the NATO countries there, but they invited NATO partners, particularly from the Asia Pacific, South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. Why? Because NATO, like the US, already has its sights set on a war with China. So NATO is a very dangerous alliance. And of course, Russia did not want to see it expanded along its borders. The second important thing to recognize about U.S. involvement is the U.S. involvement in the internal affairs of Ukraine. Nobody wants another country to be involved in its internal affairs. And here, the U.S. goes and first starts spreading U.S. dollars through agencies like the U.S. National Endowment for Democracy to create civic society groups that are pro-Western and, of course, are anti-Russian. And in fact, we have Victoria Nuland, who was the Undersecretary of State at that time, and she bragged about how by 2013, the U.S. had spent $3 billion is creating this pro-Western civil society inside Ukraine. And the year following is when there was an uprising known as the Maidan Uprising. It was an uprising against a corrupt but democratically elected government. And people came in and peacefully started gathering in what's known as Maidan Square to overthrow that government. And it turned into a violent overthrow because there were ultra-right nationalists, neo-Nazis who got involved in what was a peaceful uprising and turned it into a violent coup. And it also is important to recognize the role of the United States. And, you know, we will find out in years to come, as in the case of the overthrow of Salvador Allende in Chile or the overthrow of the elected government of Mossadegh in Iran or many others, years later, through Freedom of Information Acts, we start gathering more information about what actually happened. But here, we already know from two very important things. One is physically seeing Victoria Nuland herself outside with the protesters, giving out sandwiches and cookies and encouraging the protesters to overthrow their government. Imagine if on January 6th, when the Republicans were marching to Congress to try to enter Congress, which of course they did, if there was an official from Russia who is there giving out treats to the protesters and saying, "Good job, go in there and overthrow your government." I mean, we laugh at that because we couldn't imagine it happening, but it happened in the case of Ukraine. The other thing we know is a leaked audio tape that was Victoria Nuland herself talking to the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine at that time, actually saying, who was it that we were going to put in as the head of Ukraine when the government of Viktor Yanukovych was overthrown, and who would be pushed into the outside. So imagine we have this information showing the U.S. intimately involved in what would happen after the government was overthrown. And then, because the people in the eastern part of the country did not accept the new government that was put in place, there were the breakaway republics in the Donbass. And the Russians came in and occupied Crimea, an area of the country that they had been in Russian control for over 200 years, where the Russians have a very important warm water port, a very important base. And after that, there was an effort to stop the civil war that was going on in the Donbass, because a lot of people were getting killed. And the effort was reached an agreement a year later in 2015 in what's known as the Minsk Accords. And those Minsk Accords meant that there was going to be a new constitution for Ukraine that would give autonomy to that breakaway region in Donbass. But it wouldn't be a breakaway region. It would be an autonomous region within the nation state of Ukraine. It would not be Russian. It would not be independent. It would be Ukrainian, but it would have a degree of autonomy. That never happened. It never happened because of these ultra-right groups, armed groups in Ukraine that threatened any president, including Zelensky, who campaigned on a peace platform that he would bring peace to the country, threatened his life, said that he would be hanging from a tree if he dared to try to implement those political agreements of the Minsk Accords. And we recently have seen evidence from the countries that were supposed to guarantee this agreement, which were Germany and France, that they, the heads of state said in interviews just a few months ago that they never saw the Minsk agreement really as a peace agreement, but as a time to buy time to arm the government of Ukraine to be able to fight to take back the Donbass. And sure enough, as soon as that agreement was signed, instead of seeing an end to the fighting, what we saw is the U.S. pouring weapons into Ukraine. And at first it was under Obama, and Obama had the stipulation that they could only be defensive weapons, but then Trump came in, lifted that, and allowed for offensive weapons as well, and the training of about 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers every year. And so this was going on since 2015, with a lot of Ukrainians being killed on that border region. And when the Russians invaded on February 24th, this was a culmination of efforts that had been made to try to find a way to stop the civil war there. And those, unfortunately, were not successful. And you see the West then not only pouring in the weapons starting in 2015, but then after the Russian invasion, a tremendous amount of money spent on sending in weapons as well as economic support for the Ukrainian government. We see that Biden is very much supportive of the Ukrainian resistance, but has been reluctant to go too far because he doesn't want to antagonize Russia so much that there will be a direct war between the United States or NATO and Russia. But every time Biden has said, no, we're not going to send this weapon in because it might be used to attack inside Russia, he has been forced to change his mind by pressure and has agreed to, for example, he said no first to the HIMARS, he said no to the Patriot missiles, he said no to the tanks, changed his mind on that. He said no to F-16s, changed his mind on that. And most recently, he has gone against international treaty and sent in cluster munitions. Cluster munitions had been banned by 123 different countries, all saying that this weapon was so abhorrent because it continues to kill people long after the fighting, breaking up into these little bombs that are then lying in the fields that blow up farmers when they walk in the field, blow up little children when they pick up these shiny objects. And yet Biden decided that he would send a massive amount of cluster munitions into Ukraine. So this war is being expanded and expanded every single day, with the danger that not only will more and more people be killed, but we have to ask, where is this going? And some people think, and many people that I talk to in Ukraine think, that they can actually win this war on the battlefield. And that is something that's being told to us by the Biden administration, that there is a possibility of having victory on the battlefield. I think what we have to ask is, what is victory and how would that be achieved? We don't know what victory means. We don't know, does it mean that they would go back to the situation that existed before the Russian invasion? Or does it mean going back to 2014, taking back all of Donbass and taking back Crimea? Well, we see that there are people from inside the military who say that Russia is not going to give up Crimea without a huge fight. And indeed, if the West tried to work with Ukraine to take back Crimea, that would increase tremendously the possibility of Russia using a nuclear weapon. There are also many people who say this war is not going to be won on the battlefield. These are people like Mark Milley, the chief of staff that is the #1 advisor to Biden. And he has said, before he was pushed to kind of step back from that, that the Ukrainians, back at the time of the winter, after their successful counteroffensive, should seize the moment and go to the negotiating table. Well, the Biden administration did not listen to him, kept the war going, kept sending more and more weapons, and yet we see leaked Pentagon papers that say that no matter what happens in a new counteroffensive by the Ukrainians, it won't be enough to change the situation on the ground, and that this is a stalemate. This is a war of attrition. And sure enough, the counteroffensive that the Ukrainians were going to launch in the spring, but weren't prepared for it, they were being pushed by the West to start the counteroffensive, and so they did in the summer. It's been going on for about 2 months now, and it is a stalemate. It is a failure. And what is now being reported in a number of U.S. mainstream papers is something that we haven't seen since the war began, which is some real reporting by CNN, Washington Post, New York Times, recognizing that there is not going to be a victory on the ground. And this is changing the public opinion in the United States. You see that the opinion polls that have been taken every couple of months, more and more of the American people are now saying they don't think the U.S. should continue to fund the war in Ukraine. They think there should be a ceasefire and end negotiations. And in fact, the latest CNN poll showed 55% of the American people now saying that. Well, you might think that then 55% of the people in Congress should be reflecting that, but that is actually not the case. What we see happening in Congress is very topsy-turvy, very upside down, very head-spinning when you look at who is saying what. Normally, the peace movement would have on its side the progressive Democrats who would say we have to find a solution to this war. But right now, we see that in October of last year, there were 30 progressive Democrats who signed a letter to Biden saying, not saying stop sending weapons, not saying stop sending economic aid, but saying in addition to this, we want you to start negotiations. Well, they got slapped down so quickly from their own party that something happened that I've never seen before in all my time in Congress, which is within 24 hours they withdrew that letter. And since then, they have not only been quiet on this, they have been authorizing more and more aid to Ukraine. And so we don't have the Barbara Lee, the one woman in Congress who said no to invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11. We don't have the squad with us. We don't have Bernie Sanders with us, certainly. And so who is it that is proposing more rational policy about Ukraine now? It's not the mainstream of the Republican Party either, because they're more hawkish than the Democrats, more hawkish than Biden. In fact, what they are saying is they're blaming Biden for the lack of progress by the Ukrainian military on the ground, because they say, Biden, you're not giving enough. You're not giving it fast enough. You're not giving more dangerous weapons. And so there is a small voice in Congress, and that's the voice of what we would call the extreme right. That's the voice of people like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Lauren Boebert or Matt Gaetz. These are the ones that are initiating what I would say is the most rational policy about Ukraine. They're asking for things like, we would like an auditor to see where all this money is going. We would like an inspector general, like we had in the case of Iraq, to monitor where these billions of dollars are ending up. And they're also putting forth amendments that are very straightforward and simple and common sense. One of them was just put forward a couple of weeks ago by a congressman whose name is Warren Davidson, a very conservative Freedom Caucus congressman, a former Army Ranger, and he put forward this amendment that said, we want to know what is your definition of victory and how are you going to measure that? We want to know what is your diplomatic path? We want to know how much is this going to cost the American taxpayers, and we want it in a report within 90 days. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that's a very common sense amendment. So he got 139 Republicans to sign it, which means it moved from the extreme right Freedom Caucus into more of the mainstream of the Republicans. Can you guess how many Democrats signed that, co-sponsored that amendment? Zero. And I think we have to think about that. 0 Democrats were willing to ask Biden for a simple report on what does victory mean, what is your democratic path, and how much is it going to cost the American taxpayer. We really have to think very deeply about that. And I don't know about you, but I think that's outrageous. I think that's unacceptable. And that we have to do something about that. And so that really leaves, what are we going to do as citizens? Well, some people say it's okay because you can't talk to Putin. And there, I think we have to have a response. I have a one-word response to that, to Biden, which is try. Try. And see what happens. Because in all of this time, Biden has never tried to talk to Putin. Our Secretary of State, who is supposed to be the #1 diplomat in the United States, Anthony Blinken, has never tried to talk to his counterpart in Russia. They have this excuse saying nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. But you know what the reality is? When the Ukrainians and Russians have tried to talk and come up with a solution, they were very close to doing that just 4 weeks after the war began. And this was with the mediation of the president of Turkey, Erdogan, who was working with both sides, and they came up with a 15-point peace plan. And that peace plan said that Ukraine would be a neutral country, it wouldn't join NATO, that the Russian troops would leave, that there would be an internationally supervised referendum in the Donbass to allow those people there to determine how they wanted to be governed, and that the issue of Crimea would be pushed off into the future. They were so close until Boris Johnson from the UK came in and said, we do not support that compromise with Russia. We will support you to keep fighting to get back everything. And that's when Secretary Austin from the United States said we have to weaken Russia so that it will not be able to do that again. Well, that might be a good goal, but what does that mean, weakening Russia? Does that mean overthrowing Putin? And what would come as a result of that? And what would happen in Russia, a country that has more nuclear weapons than any other country in the world? So we have to look at ways that peace talks could commence again, recognizing that there have been talks between Russia and Ukraine about the grain deal to get Ukraine out of Ukraine, and Russia, that was successful for quite a while. The Russians pulled back recently, but I think they will probably go back into that again. There have been talks to get the International Atomic Energy Association into the nuclear power plant so that it wouldn't explode. There have been talks for prisoner swaps that have been successful and thousands of prisoners that have been exchanged. But when are we going to get back to the negotiating table to talk about the entire issue of how to solve this conflict? And if we're not getting the response we need to get from our Congress, that is the one that has the purse strings, that is the one that's going to vote on the next tranche of money, $24 billion, that Biden is asking for, that means we're not doing our job as citizens to push the negotiations forward. Our government has said no to those peace talks. Our government has said no to the peace talks that have been initiated by 6 countries in Africa who say that this conflict is affecting the entire world, and a lot of people in Africa are going hungry right now because of the increased price of grains, the increased price of energy. Our government has pushed aside negotiations that have been started by the presidents of some of the Latin American countries, the efforts by the Pope for negotiations, recently the efforts by China that put forward a 12-point peace plan. And China has a lot of legitimacy and a lot of ability to influence Putin because Russia is really dependent on China right now as the main purchaser of Russian oil. And so when China came forward with a peace plan, the Russians had to look favorably on that, even though the #1 issue on that peace plan was respect for sovereignty. And the Chinese went to Ukraine as well, and they have a lot of economic dealings with China, and so the government of Ukraine looked favorably upon that as well. But there was one country that didn't look favorably upon that possibility of a peace plan, and that again was the United States, who totally dismissed the Chinese efforts to put forward a peace plan. And that's why I, with other members of Code Pink, when there was a congressional hearing and Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, was there talking about diplomacy, we got up and we said, diplomacy, why are you not doing your job as a diplomat? The American people don't want another endless war. Do your job. If you don't like the Chinese peace plan, where is your peace plan? At what point? At that point, we got hauled away and arrested by the Capitol Police. But I think it's an important question that we were asking, where is your peace plan? And there was just a peace gathering, and I put it in quotes, in Saudi Arabia that the U.S. was promoting, that a number of countries went to, and Ukraine was certainly involved in it. And it was reported in the U.S. press that the Russians didn't attend. Well, what they didn't say is the Russians weren't invited. So that was obviously not a serious attempt at peace. And so as I travel around this country with my great partner here, Tig Barry, we have been pushing people to get involved in many different ways. One is to push our Congress people who say they don't hear very much from the side of people who want to promote peace talks. I don't know if that's true or not, but we're asking people to make at least a call to your Congress people and to your senators. We're asking people to get involved in a global days of action that are happening at the end of September and the beginning October. In fact, we have an advocacy day on October 4th where we'd like to get some people from Vermont to join us and do something like go directly to Bernie Sanders' office in Washington, D.C. and demand that he support a peace plan. We want people to be looking at and protesting the weapons companies that are making so much money from this war and are so involved constantly in keeping the United States in a constant state of war. We were recently in Vienna, Austria, one of the few neutral countries in Europe, at a gathering with representatives of 32 different countries. And it was so inspiring to be there because we met with trade unionists, we met with people from church-based communities, we met with people that were representing political parties, we met with members of parliament, and we were all talking about how this war, how dangerous it is, how it could spread into the rest of Europe and become a third world war, how it could become a nuclear confrontation, how it could lead to the explosion of one of the nuclear power plants, and people in Europe very, very concerned about how this war could expand. And we had people from Africa, we had people from Latin America, and we were all talking about how we have to push our governments. And so we came away very inspired by it and really recognizing that we do represent not only the majority in this country now, but the global majority. And in this country, we're starting to gain more space. You know, we have been protested against as we travel around, not just people handing out a piece of paper, but people who have asked to my talks to be canceled, and they have been canceled at universities, at bookstores, at churches. And it has been very difficult to be going around giving these kinds of talks. But I feel like the space is opening up not only because the public opinion is changing, but also because there are now politicians who are giving out the message calling for a ceasefire and negotiations. And those range from politicians like Donald Trump and even Ron DeSantis to politicians like Cornel West, Marianne Williamson, and people like Robert Kennedy. And they are reaching millions and millions of people, and their message might be awful on lots of different things, but on this one thing, they are basically saying it's time to find a negotiated solution. And so now we have more of a platform for discussions like this tonight. And the last thing I want to say before opening it up is that we really are part of the global majority, and we have to recognize that people around the world don't want to be forced to take sides in what they are seeing more and more as a proxy war between the United States and Russia. And someone who really represents this is the president of Brazil, known as the name of President Lula. And he came to the White House at the invitation of President Biden, and one of the things Biden pushed was for Brazil to send weapons to Ukraine, just like the U.S. is pressuring countries around the world to send weapons to Ukraine. And what President Lula came out and said before a press conference was, no, we're not going to send weapons to Ukraine. And what he has said is that what is needed is interlocutors who will talk to the Russians about the terrible mistake that they made by invading Ukraine, and talk to the Ukrainians about how important it is to go to the peace table. And he said, we don't want to join this war, we want to end this war. And I think that is the sentiment now of the majority of people in the world, the majority of the people in the United States. We don't want to keep fueling this war. We want to end this war. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you tonight.
October, we're here.
October, we are here. Why don't we go to meet to get Bernie Sanders to take and meet China?
You know, Bernie Sanders really should be for peace talk. People in this country and to address the real existential crisis that we're facing, which is the climate. So I think we have a lot to say, and Bernie Sanders should be our champion in the Senate. And that's why I think it's so important to be here. And I am really pleading with you, if some of you would join us in Washington, D.C. It would make national news if we had a sit-in in Bernie Sanders' office. Anybody here willing to go to Washington to talk to Bernie? We got 1, 2, 3, 4, a half of a hand, another 5. Okay, that's a good start. 6, yeah.
Can you help me understand what peace would look like? And what would be a peace agreement from your perspective?
Well, I mentioned the 15-point plan, and I think that's a logical way to start, which is to say Russian troops out, neutrality for Ukraine, which means that it would have strong countries that would guarantee its security, a referendum internationally supervised in the Donbass, and put off the issue of Crimea.
Why would you put off the issue?
Because Zelensky was willing to put it off for 10 years at one point, because he knew that the majority of people in Russia right now, in Crimea right now, are ethnic Russians. There was a referendum that was taken in 1991. This is before Putin. And this was when the Soviet Union was breaking up and Ukraine declared its independence. And they had a referendum in Crimea asking what they would want. 94% of the people said they did not want to be part of Ukraine. That was in 1991. And there have since been referendums, and people might say, well, we don't think that those are, they were internationally supervised, and so we don't recognize them. But we have to recognize that the majority of people in Crimea now are ethnic Russians. And so Zelensky was willing to do that. I think there are many people now who see that the issue of Crimea is...
have a military base.
They have, Russians have very few military bases outside of Russia, and now, of course, they consider Crimea part of Russia. But it is, I think, given the fact that Zelensky at one point himself was willing to do that, is because they recognize that Russia is not going to leave Crimea. And if...
What about the Crimean Tatars?
Well, that, you can go back and criticize Russia for having discriminated against and expelled a number of Tatars and then brought in the ethnic Russians, but that is what exists today from the time of the Soviet Union, but that is what exists now. And so what are you going to say? We're going to go back and repopulate Crimea? I don't think that is possible.
It's happened for 30 years.
Well, we have talked to many people in Crimea and have a lot of people who have recently visited Crimea. What they say is that the people that they have talked to are happy being part of Russia. So the idea there is also at some point to have an internationally supervised referendum. But as I said, that is something that more and more is starting to be recognized, that it's going to have to be part of a territorial compromise that Ukraine is going to have to make. Yeah.
Yeah, I recently read a detailed argument by a high-level Russian officer, Karaganov, I think his name is. He wrote a detailed and very serious argument promoting the idea that Russia should make a first strike, a nuclear strike, on Europe as a way to frighten the Americans. A very detailed, serious argument. I'm just wondering whether you take that seriously or if you have any reaction to that.
Well, it's horrific. Anybody threatening the use of nuclear weapons is absolutely horrific. And I think that the fact that you have a proxy war going on now between the two greatest nuclear powers in the world is something that we should all be so frightened about. And the fact that there are people who are threatening the use of nuclear weapons, you have to think back to the time of John F. Kennedy, when a year after the missile crisis, gave a talk at American University and said, when you're in a conflict with a nuclear power, never leave them with only two options. One is a humiliating defeat, and the other is the use of a nuclear weapon. And that is the road, that is the path that we're taking right now. And so I think that, whether or not it's a high-level Russian or whether or not it's somebody in the Senate who has said horrific things about the use of a nuclear weapon against Russia, we should condemn anybody who is threatening to use nuclear weapons, but we should take it as a warning sign that this is such a dangerous conflict, and whether by accident or by design could really lead to a much wider conflict. And that's something that even the head of NATO said at one point, that this could spin terribly out of control. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier several peace plans that have been made by China, for instance, to trying to find a way for peace. I have here the peace plan that was written by Zelensky in last November 22. And I'm sure you know the details, but I'll just read a little bit. He calls for radiation and nuclear safety, focusing on restoring security around Zaporizhzhia, food security, including protecting and answering Ukraine's grain export, energy security, restoring Ukraine's territorial integrity, and so on, withdrawal of Russian troops. And so it's all points seems very reasonable to me, and I'm sure many people here. And it was instantly rejected by Russia, and the Minister of Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, called it Zelensky unrealistic condition make this peace deal very hard to achieve. So I'm just, I'm just wondering who. So certainly Biden doesn't, he seems like he's not willing to talk, but it seems on the other end that they're not so keen on discussing.
Well, there are two sides now who have taken extreme positions, and this is not a peace plan. This is a starting point for negotiations. You have Russia on the one side that says now it's not just the line of the Donbass before we invaded, it's where we are now, which is now 20% of the territory. And they even say they are calling parts of Ukraine Russia that they don't even control right now. And they say we want to keep Crimea. That's their negotiating position. The negotiating position on the part of Zelensky is we want everything back. We want Russia prosecuted for war crimes, and we want Russia to pay for reconstruction of our country. Those are the two positions. Those are not peace plans. Those are entry points for discussions. And then from there have to be compromises made by both sides. Yes?
I remember hearing a couple weeks ago on the radio, Zelensky's voice saying, we don't want just victory, we want punishment. And that's in line with his reparations. And I know you don't have to be as old as some of us to know that it's a common history. Punishing Germany at the end of World War I is what made World War II happen. So Zelensky is asking for us to do that same dreadful mistake again.
Well, it would be nice if people who commit war crimes are held accountable for that. And we certainly wish that our government would have been held accountable for all the war crimes that we committed in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and in Libya. And unfortunately, powerful countries are not held accountable, especially if they're the victorious countries. We want an international world order to be upheld. We want war crimes to be prosecuted. But as you say, what we need now is not to focus on the prosecution, we need to focus on ending the war. I get back to this issue of, I think it's fine for the both sides to come in with those very, very different positions. But there's got to be an ability to be flexible. And if China is able to push Russia to get to the peace table, then the U.S. has to be the one to push Zelensky. Let's face it, if the U.S. wasn't sending billions of dollars every single month, there would be negotiations. Zelensky would have to negotiate. But as long as the West keeps funding this war, it keeps extending the war. Let's see. Anybody else? Yes, over there.
Question. So it seems clear to my ear, as someone who benefits materially from the U.S. imperialist mission, begrudgingly, but I do benefit, it's my job to critique the U.S. side of this. And I'm not interested in, is Russia more to blame or is Russia more fucked up than the U.S. is? We're both fucked up. The question is, can you talk more about what we have to gain from this? Because we clearly want this. Our government, on our behalf, clearly wants this war. We spend more on this war than we've spent on climate change. So clearly we want it. So can you talk more about why? Why does our government want this? What is the material, what is the imperialist agenda behind that?
Yeah, and what are the resources that are also connected to that?
Yeah. Well, first is just the larger issue of U.S. hegemony. And whether it's a Democrat or Republican, they want the U.S. to be at the head of the table, leading the world. And maintaining this hegemony is not only why they want to see Russia weakened, but really because they want to see Russia not being a strong partner to China, because the real adversary, as they say straight out, is China, because China threatens U.S. hegemony. China is becoming a greater economic power than the United States precisely because we're spending $1 trillion of our tax money on militarism instead of on economic uplifting of our people and people around the world. So you have to look at it in that larger context, but also to recognize that our empire is in the decline, and that the U.S. doesn't want to admit that this is already a multipolar world, that this is already a world in which big powers and other powers want to get off the dollar. I remember reading something from President Lula that said, I wake up every morning and I wonder, why do we have to trade in dollars? And, you know, he is part of the grouping called the BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, that now represent a larger portion of the global economy than the G7 does. And they're meeting next week in South Africa, and they've got 24 nations that want to join the BRICS, because they see that as where the energy globally is happening. So hegemony is the answer in the larger picture. In the smaller picture, we do have to recognize how powerful the weapons industry and all of these companies that feed off the trough of the Pentagon are. Because just in the last 20 years, they have become so much more powerful because they get so much money. It is incredible. You know, we live in Washington, D.C. The richest counties of the United States are the ones in Virginia, in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. Where do they get that money? From the U.S. government, and most of them from money that comes from the Pentagon. And that is this vicious cycle of corruption in our government where they have more lobbyists than members of Congress, where they give money to the campaigns of our elected officials, where even people like Bernie Sanders gets over $250,000 from a weapons industry. So it's really a very, very, very corrupt system. And they're not the only ones who benefit from this war and wars in general, and particularly this war. It's also the energy companies. You know, Tig and I used to go into the hearings in Congress and used to hear the representatives from Texas, like Ted Cruz, the senator from Texas, who would be talking about something we didn't even know what it was. And he would be talking about the Nord Stream pipeline and saying, how can we let the Germans and Europe be building this pipeline that's going to allow them to get cheap energy from Russia? We can't allow that to happen. And we were thinking, God, that's so, I mean, how can he think we can tell the Europeans where to get their energy? And indeed, thanks to this war and the blowing up of the pipeline, and let's, you know, think of who had a motive to blow that up, the energy companies have gotten record profits this last year because of substituting for that energy that's been sanctioned from Russia. And they're selling the Europeans U.S. energy at like 4 times the price that the Russians were selling that energy. So those dirty energy companies are profiting from it. It's also been the excuse for Biden to expand licenses for oil production, for gas production, for refineries. And then the financial companies that have already signed, you know, BlackRock. Have you heard of BlackRock? The biggest and financial investment company in the United States has already signed a memorandum of understanding with Zelensky for financing the rebuilding of Ukraine. And there is a website where you see Zelensky, it's about investing in Ukraine, says the best investment opportunity since World War II, and asking U.S. Western companies to get ready to invest. So unfortunately, while soldiers are dying every single day, while civilians are dying, while people are losing their limbs, there are people who profit from blowing up things, and there are people who are ready to profit from rebuilding them.
Can I just say something?
Yeah.
I completely understand and agree with you about the militarization of the world. And believe me, I'm an immigrant to this country. I'm a Ukrainian. My parents are forced laborers. I worked in Ukraine. I was on the Maidan. And I have a slightly different perspective on your initial presentation of Ukraine as East and West, because that's a paradigm that's been used. It's a colonial paradigm. And I don't see that. When I was on the Maidan, I saw LGBT members participating. I saw former Red Army parents supporting students. I saw Jewish students participating in. I mean, I did not see Victoria Nuland.
You missed the sandwiches and
I
the.
stayed in tents with people who, what they wanted was to have a closer relationship with Europe. They weren't interested in NATO. And also what they didn't want is they didn't want a dictator who was raping their country. You know, Yanukovych raped the country with $95 billion. And Putin paid him $75 million to withdraw from the European Union agreement.
Well, we can.
What I ask is that we look at history from a Ukrainian perspective. I also was in eastern Ukraine several years back when I saw Russian-speaking Ukrainians demonstrating while they were being occupied, risking their lives. So it's a little bit of who are you talking to and who am I viewing?
Well,
I ask that we listen to Ukrainians. One of the things about Zelensky is he's being portrayed as a neo-fascist. Here's a man who's Jewish, who lost family in the Holocaust. He knows very well. The reason that he's being demonized by Putin is because he's more popular in Russia than Putin. And so let's begin to look at Ukraine not from an imperialist perspective in terms of Russia and almost an old Cold War perspective, but look at it from a perspective of a sovereign country that's trying to build its own nation state and its sovereignty, and it's being invaded.
Well, I appreciate your perspective, and thank you for being here, and thank you for voicing that. I certainly don't call Zelensky a neo-fascist. I certainly recognize that the uprising in Maidan was a outpouring of people who wanted to get rid of a corrupt government. But I also recognize how it turned violent, how at that time there were negotiations going on, and Yanukovych had agreed that there were going to be very quick elections to be held. And many people in the Maidan and the leadership agreed with that, and that was going forward until it became violent. And
are we reading history correctly?
Well, I would love it if you took, I will give you a free copy of my book, and if you could read it and we could talk about it afterwards, because I've been told by many Ukrainians that they find the book to be very fair, very even-handed. So thank you. I look forward to continuing the conversation. Yes.
I've noticed recently that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the people who run the the doomsday clock, seem to be silent, as far as I can tell, on this whole issue of Ukraine. That they don't seem too concerned about it.
Well, we're 4 minutes to midnight.
I'm just wondering, but I mean, they publish articles, many of them are about climate change or other subjects, but I haven't noticed any articles or discussion about Ukraine from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and I'm just wondering if that's what you know, and not just them, but other people that you would expect to be voicing some discussion about this are totally silent. And I just wonder.
Yeah, it's a very astute observation from your part. And when we have been looking for how to expand the base of people that are pushing for peace, we've gone to the interfaith community, and we have now thousands of faith-based leaders who are working with us. And we've gone to the mayors of 1,300 cities that are part of something called Mayors for Peace, who passed a resolution saying we have problems of infrastructure, homelessness, all kinds of things in our cities. We can't afford to be throwing so much money into this war. We need you to find a solution. And we've gone to the people that have been working on ending the possibility, trying to ban nuclear weapons and working for disarmament. And lo and behold, in that community, we have found a lot of division. So groups like the one that you mentioned has not been willing to come out in favor of peace talks. Groups like Physicians for Social Responsibility that are part of that same network are very divided. The letter that we wrote that we asked them to sign on to that talks about the tremendous danger of a nuclear war has been signed by many of the local groups of Physicians for Responsibility, but not by the national. And they have been lobbying the national, but there's differences on the board, and so they can't get it passed. But we feel that it is a very important community that should be speaking out a lot more than it is. Now, one of our great advocates who recently passed away is Dan Ellsberg, who was very involved around trying to stop a nuclear war. And I remember when I was writing the book, calling him to see his take on this. And he was very angry at Russia for having invaded. And he was very angry at the United States for in its interference in Ukraine. And he said that the danger of nuclear war was tremendous. And he started to help us to try to get more people in that community. And so we have maybe about 150 people who are part of that community who have signed on to the letter and be happy to share it with you. But we are still trying to get the organizations themselves to come out, and it's unfortunate that it's been so difficult. Yes?
Medea, I'm curious about what your response to the point in the paper about anti-imperialism to be true to its name as anti-all imperialisms. I'm really curious to hear what your response to this would be. Like, I know it's a bit more abstract and conceptual compared to the other questions you received tonight, but I would love to hear what your response to that specific point would be.
Well, I would say that in general, anybody who wants to promote a peaceful world where people have the right to self-determination have to be against all kinds of imperialism. I think it means opposing efforts by any government, whether it's US, Russia, or China, to be taking over other sovereign nations, to be imposing their will, whether it's through military means or economic means. But that said, I do look at where I want to put my energies and my efforts as an American and somebody who is well aware of the history of my country, and as Martin Luther King said, the country that's the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. I want to put my energy into trying to change my country. So maybe we have time for one more. Does anybody have a, yeah?
How do you convince the working and middle class to end this war, or to help end this war, being that our lives, especially the working class people, their time is not spent protesting, their time is spent feeding their families, not here. And so this idea of calling your senator, local congressman, is just something so abstract as like, I need to feed my family. What do you say to those people? Or how can we talk to those people?
Yeah, I think we can certainly talk to those people about whether you want to talk about it on the $1 trillion that we're spending on militarism, or you want to focus in on the issue of Ukraine, which will now be $140 billion. There's a group called the National Priorities Project that can give you, for every city in this country, what could be done with that money to feed people, to house people, to get free college education for people. And I think when you look at the polls, opinion polls that are taken, when you break it down, for example, there have been some broken down by ethnicity, you see that the ethnic group that is most opposed to war in general has been the black community, because they really understand what these trade-offs have been. And yet, it's not like you're going to get lots of members of the black community to come out to protest or to do a sit-in in Bernie Sanders' office. Of course, your state is quite white, but people are with us. And when you get somebody like Cornel West, who's able to go out and speak to the black community, he's finding tremendous support in that community on these issues of ending a war economy and a militarized country. And then I guess I would also say that it's important to recognize that public opinion is changing. And that to me is so fascinating and hopeful, because it goes against the mainstream narrative that we're hearing in the press. It goes against what we're hearing from the White House. It goes against what we're hearing from the vast majority of people in Congress. And yet, the majority of people are seeing through that. And, you know, you get people like Trump, who is a real opportunist, who pretends somehow that this is, whether he is as rich as he says he is, but this guy is somehow the champion of the working class is ridiculous. But there are many people who do look towards him. And he says, if I get elected before I even go to the White House, I will pick up the phone and call my two friends, Zelensky and Putin, and we will solve this crisis. that Biden won't even talk to Putin. So, you know, this is something that he gets great response from. He's using it in all of his rallies right now. And I'm saying this because I think that working people do innately understand that these wars are not wars that are for their national security and their protection. And the final thing I want to say is that I think more and more working people are understanding the real threat of the climate disaster, because it's affecting so many people personally right now. And to understand that you can't cooperate with China if you are intending to have a war with China. You can't have a cooperative relationship with Russia if you are in a proxy war with Russia. That the world needs cooperation. And I do think that the majority of people want to see the U.S. as a force for peace, want to see the U.S. as a country that promotes cooperation with other countries around the world. And so I would say in general, we have the working class with us. We just have to find ways to manifest that in an overt way so that the politicians really understand where the future of our country should be going and how they can have policies that really represent what is in the best interests of the working people and all people in this country. So thank you. You want to say something about the book, $20? Oh.
So we have books on sale. Medea will sign them up here, $20. We can take any kind of payment. And I don't know where the clipboard is, but
October 3rd is the
you want
big
to sign on the
3rd and
clipboard,
4th, yeah.
It's good.
And a free book for this gentleman here or anybody else who wants one. So anybody interested in coming to DC, maybe we could have just a quick little hello right here.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. Now, we're going to give you a book because we're staying with you, so take your money already. Oh, you're very sweet.
And I'll take the free one.
Okay, and is it Sylvia or Sylvia?
It's Sylvia with a Y.
I think what you want to do is you want to put an asterisk next to the names of the people that are interested, right?
Yeah.